Just to remind you, it's oneclimate.net, their island on Second Life on which you're inhabiting. So keep the questions coming. Here's William from Scotland. What exactly does a typical small island want by the end of this week? I think this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Okay.
Well, I guess there are two broad things that are typical. I would consider FSM to be a typical small island state, although we're comprised of about 600 small islands.
Sorry, FSM, that's the Federated States of Micronesia, is it?
Yeah. The Federated States of Micronesia. I mean, two broad goals. The two broad topics, I guess you could say, that the countries are here talking about are adaptation and mitigation. And on mitigation, what we're hoping is that the process that's agreed for going forward to negotiate future targets, future commitments, will actually be sufficiently ambitious to avoid serious impacts on small island states. So we're very much viewing the outcomes of this post-2012 discussion. We'll consider it to have been effective if the avoidance of impacts on small island states is considered, the benchmark. So on mitigation, that's it. We're looking for a level of global ambition that can actually respond to our needs and take us toward, the ultimate objective of the convention, which is the avoidance of dangerous, climate change. So that's one thing. That's on mitigation. On adaptation, what we're looking for is more support for adaptation actions on the ground. For years and years, we've been saying, look, enough with the assessments. It's always funding for assessments. There's no funding for projects on the ground. Well, here at this session, we've had negotiations on the Adaptation Fund, which is a fund that's created under the Kyoto Protocol, but which hasn't come into operation yet. And so after a couple of years of negotiation, we finally have an agreement as of a couple of hours ago on how the Adaptation Fund will be structured and how it will be put into operation. So that's an outcome. And hopefully it'll take another year to come up with policies, procedures, and whatnot. But probably after another year, we'll have in place opportunities for countries to come in with proposals for funding. The whole thing is incredibly slow and painful, but at least the fact that there is an adaptation fund, and hopefully within about a year that'll be accessible by a range of countries. But the fund was designed for particularly vulnerable developing countries. So for small island states, this is hopefully will become the first stop for adaptation project funding.
Okay, I have a sense you're giving us a bit of news here. So the adaptation fund, which is to help developing countries pay for measures to deal with climate change, that's agreed. Well, that's one of the outcomes of the conference that was hoped for, is it? But what's been agreed? That there is a fund? It's a sort of governance of the fund, not that there will be X billion dollars in it? Hardly.
No, what's been agreed is really the structure for the fund, not the fund itself. The concept of the fund was agreed in Kyoto. It's a fund that's created from a share of the proceeds of clean development mechanism projects, a 2% share of the proceeds. So basically this money goes into a pot, and the issue is what do you do with the funds in the pot? How do you manage access to that fund? And what's been agreed is that there will be an adaptation fund board that's controlled by parties to the convention, with a majority of developing country parties. And below that adaptation fund will be a secretariat that will be under the control of the adaptation fund board, which itself is under the control of the Kyoto parties. But a secretariat and then a trustee. And it's the relationship between these bodies that we've been negotiating. So essentially the institutional arrangements, this was the last sticking point. Who would be tasked to actually manage the fund? Very political, because there's been a lot of distrust. Distrust is a strong word. A lot of dissatisfaction over the years with the Global Environment Facility, which has been handling other adaptation funding under this process. It was hoped that the adaptation fund, this new fund, could be doing something different and actually be more responsive to developing country needs. So we'll see.
We'll see. I think this is one of the sort of critical confusions in the public's mind. I don't mean the public out there, I mean mine too, and everybody's who's watching, as distinct from the people who are in the room, is that we think, this is a process there'll be cuts in emissions and life will be saved. Whereas, in fact, many of the negotiations are about procedural or administrative, institutional matters. But I suppose once they're cleared up, the hope is people will come and announce money for is that what the ministers are going to do when they turn up? Some of them may make a gesture and say, we'll put money into the fund.
Yeah, there may be gestures, but gestures aren't enough. It's almost comical. Years back there were gestures made with a special climate change fund and an LDC fund, and the amounts pledged were minimal and have been, in relative terms, minimal ever since. It's hoped that the adaptation fund over time, by accessing private investments in mitigation projects, will really expand. There's a need to find, still further streams of financing for adaptation, unquestionably, but this will be one of the, at least in the short term, one of the bigger sources of funding.
Hey, you've hit some nerves here. There's questions coming in here. Well, here's a question. Have you seen any difference this year than in past negotiations? I think this means differences in attitude and the feeling of that you get in the negotiating hall.
I guess it depends which year. You know, some years are far worse than other years, and it tends to depend on the administration in place in a few key countries. That makes a big difference to the mood of negotiations, and I won't be more specific than that.
Okay, this one came with a follow-up. Isn't this development on the adaptation fund a big deal? Are developing countries happy about it?
Well, developing countries, most negotiators are relieved that the issue is at least concluded for this negotiating session. You know, I mean, one of the EU negotiators came up to me and said, "Thank you." And I think he's just, I think people are just happy that it's kind of resolved. But really, it's just resolved for now, and it's one step that's resolved, and putting the wheels in motion will continue over the next, Lord knows how many negotiating sessions. Is it a big deal? It's a big deal that we've resolved this roadblock, and the roadblock was who would manage this fund. Who would manage it? Will it be business as usual with the Global Environment Facility managing the fund in a way that developing countries find frustrating because small islands can't get access to the fund or have to deal with new conditionalities that the Jeffs put on access to funding? The adaptation fund that's been agreed, it was agreed years ago, but that we continue to reach new decisions on. What's different about it is that control over access to that fund will reside more closely in an adaptation fund board that's comprised of different groupings, but basically there'll be more developing country control over how the procedures for accessing this fund are set.
Okay, I'm sorry to stick the mic under your nose, but I think there's a committee, negotiating group must have finished because there's lots of people standing around talking. Question from here. What is coral bleaching?
Okay, it's basically, if you watch TV, you watch Jacques Cousteau and people are snorkeling or, doing scuba diving. Basically what you see, coral formations underwater are very, very colorful because you have living organisms. If the sea surface temperature increases a certain amount, you kill off these organisms and you're left with skeletons. So you lose the life. And that's essentially what it is.
Yeah, which is pretty serious for a Pacific island surrounded by coral. Ken London, what adaptation activities might be done in Micronesia?
It could be a range of things. I mean, one of the early projects that was costed was a ring road around one of the islands, and there was a costing done of what it would take to actually raise the road sufficiently so that with sea level rise, basically that would be wrapped into the planning for that road. How can I put this? I guess the road was going to be extended anyway, but there was a study done as to how much more it would cost to actually climate-proof the road, to actually build it, another however many feet high, or off the high. And substantial cost. And of course, this was a cost that's really attributable to trying to stay ahead of sea level rise. And then the question is who's going to pay for it? Because small island states do not have these resources, and have not caused these impacts. And so you have serious questions of equity, at stake. And in theory, through this process, developed countries are meant to be providing financial assistance to help particularly vulnerable countries meet the cost of adaptation. That's an actual commitment in the convention. And we're still, of course, waiting and waiting. What can be said?